A Missouri woman's remains are found weeks after she went missing. Now we're learning the shocking details leading up to her death, as prosecutors say she was tied up to a wheelchair and forced to watch her killer dig her own grave.
He put this woman through literally hell and back before shooting her. It's hard to even imagine what kind of human being is capable of doing that.
Investigators say it was the victim's ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend who were responsible for the gruesome crime. And apparently there was a history of abuse.
That this was not an isolated incident, that this is something that built up over time.
This is 43-year-old Amy Hogue. She was last seen on June 20th in rural Washington County, Missouri, nearly 75 miles south of St. Louis. Almost right away, Hogue's family knew something was off. Her first grandchild was born just 4 days before her disappearance, and she never had the chance to meet him. They say that was totally out of character. By mid-July, Hogue's purse was found in a river in nearby Jefferson County. Washington County Sheriff Zach Jacobson told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that after finding the purse, they, quote, realized she was probably dead. At that point, Washington County authorities requested an arrest warrant as the investigation pointed in the direction of Hogue's ex-boyfriend, 36-year-old Tony Charboneau. Investigators say Charboneau was a suspect right away because he apparently had a history of violence against Hogue. In May 2023, he allegedly hit Hogue's head so hard that she passed out. At the time of her disappearance, he was in the midst of another case involving Hogue from an October 2023 altercation. At first, the investigation into Hogue's disappearance was stalled because of lack of evidence. The case was placed in rural Missouri, in areas where cell phone service is lacking, and there wasn't much of a digital footprint left behind. But a break in the case came when investigators turned to Charboneau's girlfriend, 40-year-old Brandi Luffy. Luffy confessed to authorities that both she and Charboneau were responsible for Hogue's murder, and she didn't hold back on details. Luffy told investigators that the day Hogue went missing, she was at Charboneau's home when they got into a fight. As she tried to leave, Charboneau began kicking and punching her and eventually tied her to a wheelchair. According to court documents, while she was in the wheelchair, the defendant and Brandi went and collected shovels, tarps, pickaxe, and a firearm. Then, with her still tied to the wheelchair, lifted the chair into the back of the vehicle. Charboneau then drove both Hogue and Luffy to a secluded area in a rural part of the county. Once there, Charboneau began digging a grave as he forced Hogue to watch. Once the shallow grave had been dug, Charboneau allegedly shot Hogue in the head. He then, quote, spent the rest of the day burying her in the grave, covering her with large rocks and tree limbs. Brandi stayed at the vehicle and was a watch out for any persons that may come. After Luffy confessed all this to authorities, she led investigators to Hogue's body. Hogue was found partially decomposed with an obvious bullet wound to her head.
Anytime we talk about the brutality that's described in this case, we're of course horrified, but then again, we consistently hear about cases, particularly in domestic violence cases, where the crimes are so horrific that we can't believe this is what our society has come to.
To understand what led up to Hogue's murder, we sat down with Law&Crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman. Let's talk about that domestic abuse side of things, because in this case, it seemed that the couple, the defendant and then the victim, had a history, a relationship, and it involved some domestic abuse. There were red flags leading up to that. So do you think that's something that prosecutors are going to highlight moving forward, that he had this history of aggression and violence?
Absolutely. I think part of the motive is going to be, particularly if this is a case that goes to a jury, that this was not an isolated incident, that this is something that built up over time. And it's also going to be a way for them to show that he is in fact the person that is responsible, because he's someone that had this history with her in the past, and it simply continued into the events that led to her death.
And I mean, domestic assault in general is really horrific and unfortunate that so many people are involved in a situation like that. But this is almost escalated to the next level in the fact that she was restrained to this wheelchair and then had to watch her own grave be dug. That's something I've never heard before. Does that add a layer to you?
anytime an individual is killed, particularly in a domestic violence scenario, it's horrifying, and no one wants to imagine that these are the type of things that happen. When you hear about a case like this, where it's so deliberate, where he put this woman through literally hell and back before shooting her, it's hard to even imagine what kind of human being is capable of doing that. Remember, he not only beats her while his new girlfriend is standing by assisting, but he ties her to a wheelchair. He brings her out to the woods. He and his girlfriend dig a grave while she watches. And then ultimately shoot and kill her. Now, obviously, none of this is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So we're always cautious when we talk about these cases, that this is what the allegations are. But if they are true, then it's hard to imagine what type of human being is capable of this.
After Luffy's confession, both she and Charboneau were charged with multiple offenses. Charboneau faces charges of first-degree murder, first-degree domestic assault, first-degree kidnapping, abandonment of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and conspiracy to commit a felony. Luffy's charges are slightly different. Second-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, abandonment of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and conspiracy to commit a felony. And in terms of charges, the boyfriend faces a first-degree murder charge, among others, and his girlfriend a second-degree murder charge. Do you think that these charges make sense?
Well, if you assume that he's the person that fired the shot, that he's the person that, in a sense, planned these events, then yes, there's a reason that they're distinguishing his actions versus her actions. Now, remember, if she cooperates, one would assume that she's going to be getting a very good deal, or a much better deal than she would have gotten if she didn't. And so while she's charged with second degree, at the end of the day, she may end up pleading guilty to something that benefits her even more if the end result is going after the person that the prosecution believes is the person that actually pulled the trigger.
But if we're looking at the most severe charge in this case, first-degree murder, there's one major factor to consider. To me, this shows a lot of premeditation, at least based on the allegations. The fact that he tied her up, transported her to this area in the middle of nowhere, and then dug a grave as she watched. I mean, at any point, he could have turned around the car. He could have unlatched her from this wheelchair or stopped digging a grave. Do you think that there's a lot of premeditation in this case?
I agree with you 100%. And remember, a lot of times with murder cases, you don't need premeditation in order to prove the murder. In fact, sometimes you only need to have premeditation for a moment in time prior to the murder to be able to prove it. Here you have someone that is so deliberate, so calculating in the decisions they made. By the way, even bringing her out to a field to take him away from his own home to make sure that she wouldn't potentially be found is another indication, not just of premeditation, but someone who is looking to get away with a horrific murder.
Since Hogue's disappearance, Washington County authorities have been outspoken about the investigation, saying the location of the crime poses a specific issue. Something that's interesting about this crime that takes place in Missouri, some of the reports I've seen show that it was in this rural area, and investigators were kind of struggling because a lot of these areas don't have cell phone service. A lot of people don't live there, so it's not like we can take video from Ring camera or doorbell footage, anything like that. So does that make things a little bit more difficult in terms of when this goes to trial? I know oftentimes we see text logs or phone calls or GPS tracking, but we won't have any of these things if this case does go forward to trial.
So Sierra, that's such a great question. And I want you to realize, and if we think back, years ago, they were able to make out murder cases without texts, without cell towers, without cell phones, without videos. And they relied on other types of evidence in order to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so in a sense, that's what they're going to be looking at here. And they really have to teach a jury to understand that not every case has this new sophisticated evidence, and you don't need it if you're able to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt based on other pieces of evidence. And one of the things I think they're going to have here that is unique to many other cases is they're probably going to have one of the co-defendants, the girlfriend. And I think it's likely that she's going to be the key to unraveling this case and enabling the jury to really get an inside look at exactly what happened that brought this.
Let's talk about the girlfriend because, as you said, she is a co-defendant. She was allegedly part of this murder. She's also the one who came forward to investigators and apparently confessed to what happened and laid out, here's what I did, here's what my boyfriend did. So do you think that the prosecution is really going to try to make her a star witness in the case against her boyfriend?
Absolutely. And I think what they're going to one of the things they have to do is they have to rule out that she is the person that did the shooting, for example, because remember, she's blaming the violent acts on him. And she's maybe putting herself more at the periphery, saying she was more the lookout. She helped, but she wasn't the person who fired the fatal shots. And so what they're really going to try to do is establish, how do we know that it's him, not her? Is there DNA that establishes somehow that the gun was handled by him and not someone else? The domestic violence aspects of this case, I believe, is something they're going to use to say it was him, it wasn't his girlfriend that fired that fatal shot.
Then there's the question of why Hogue was murdered in the first place. And I know motive isn't something that we require in order to have a conviction. It's just something that we like to talk about a lot, and honestly helpful for jurors at times to know why something happened. But in this case, is it something that prosecutors might look toward and say, okay, he probably had more of a motive to murder his ex-girlfriend rather than his current girlfriend who didn't have as much of a connection with the victim?
Well, I mean, one could argue it both ways. I mean, sometimes people say, well, the girlfriend has more of a motive because maybe she's jealous of the relationship. Remember, there's at least some evidence that it was the deceased that was at her ex's home at the time the alleged incidents began. But yes, you're right. Motive is not required. And remember, we've talked many times where there's times where individuals will kill someone because they gave them a look that they didn't like, and that was enough to cause their death. Here, I think when we talk about the motive is potentially going to go back to that domestic violence. This is a person that is out of control. In a sense, what the prosecutor is going to say is this is the person that did all the domestic violence to her in the past, not the ex-girlfriend. Now, they have to be careful, remember, because you can't have someone's prior acts because someone violently hit someone in the past, because someone assaulted them, doesn't mean that they committed a murder. So there has to be a balance, and a judge is going to have to determine that balance, the prejudice, and whether the probative value outweighs the prejudice in terms of how much of that prior domestic violence history will come in.
Because of Luffy's history working with law enforcement and leading them to Hogue's body, it's easy to infer that she may start working with the prosecution and flip to their side. But what about Charboneau's potential defense? All of this kind of leads into my next question, because we talked about how the prosecution is likely going to go toward the girlfriend and say, hey, can you flip? Will you be our star witness, going against her boyfriend? But what about his defense? Do you think that potentially his team is going to point the finger at his current girlfriend?
So, look, time will tell, obviously, in terms of what their ultimate defense will be. And as well as I do, many of these cases plead out before we ever hear what their defense is. But yes, if there's no other corroborative evidence of what she said happened, then the logical decision for the part of the defense attorney is going to be like, let's blame her. Let's put everything on her. Let's have him be the person that was simply the lookout and just confuse the jury as to which one. Because remember, you have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And so, yes, I certainly think that may be a viable defense. But again, you have to be careful. There's questions as to, in terms of the girlfriend, did she come forward on her own? How specific was she? Is she able to describe things that are corroborated by other pieces of evidence? I think that's what the defense is going to want to know.
So it seems likely that Luffy will flip, so to speak, but it's not guaranteed. And we've kind of assumed that she's going to cooperate with prosecutors, at least because she's already been pretty upfront with investigators. But is it still possible that she could come back and recant her confession?
It is, but remember, she's already told them basically where to find the body, and the body was found. So we already know, based on what she's had to say, that she's at least accurate about some of the information. We don't know everything. But when you read the affidavit in terms of probable cause, the reason we know the details is because what she told them, because many of these things one would never know. They wouldn't have known how she ended up getting to that location, how she ended up in the ground in the first place. And so she really has provided so much information. Could she later recant and say, I'm not going to assist you? She could, but then she's left with her own confession, which is admitting to cooperating and assisting in the murder of another human being.
Rendleman says if the case is headed to trial, prosecutors have a strong argument and some pretty gruesome details to lay out for jurors. And murder really is something that we talk about all the time on Law and Crime. It's unfortunate, but it's really what we focus on a lot. In this case, though, what stands out to me is the digging of the grave thing. That's something that I personally have yet to hear before. So if you're thinking this case is actually going to go to trial, do you think that's something that prosecutors are going to highlight on because it's so unique and truly gruesome for the victim?
Absolutely. Anytime you are a prosecutor, you're going to want to present to the jury, besides all the facts that assist you in proving that someone's guilty, but all those facts that in a sense make a jury cringe. And you're going to want to do it really early on in the process. You're going to want to open to this jury to describe what the last moments of life were for this woman, what she saw and what she felt. And you really want the jury to have a sense of being there. You want an opening statement to be so effective that they really almost don't want to hear anything. They think he's guilty from the start.
You kind of speculated about whether this will head to trial, if there will be a plea deal. What are your assumptions or predictions moving forward with this case?
So it's a good question. I think it depends on several things. It depends on, I assume the defense is going to review all of the statements that the co-defendant has made. Are there inconsistencies with what she said? Did she originally say one thing and then she changed it to another? Is there corroboration of what she said? Meaning, if she says, for example, that he burned the items, is there DNA? Is there something that shows it was him that did it and not her? The motive we talked about, who had the bigger motive, him or her? And all of those things are going to be things that you evaluate, coupled with what's the offer? Is the offer something that will enable him to eventually get out one day? And I think those are the factors, along with what the defendant wants, as to the ultimate decision whether this case will go to trial.
Since their arrests on August 2nd, both defendants have been held in the Washington County Jail. As of right now, both of the defendants are being held on $1 million cash bond. Do you think that's an appropriate amount?
So we always talk about this because in New York, if someone was charged with the crimes that we just saw, who had a history of domestic violence, they would be remanded. There would be no $1 million bail. There would not even be $2 million bail. So I'm always shocked to hear it. With that said, one could only assume that the basis of the judge setting this bail is the awareness that he won't be able to make the bail. And he hasn't been able to make the bail. So the assumption is that that's kind of where the judge fell. But I'm always shocked to not hear that a case of this magnitude, a defendant is not remanded and held without bail.
Looking ahead, Charboneau is set to appear in Washington County Court on August 28th for a preliminary hearing. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Gillespie.